I want to bring to your attention firstly, before we actually take a look at the Bitcoin price itself, what I want to bring to your attention is what's happening here on this chart. And you may remember about some weeks ago, at the beginning of November, I said, look, pay attention to this pulse signal that's happening here on this chart, these red dots. Because when these red dots turn to blue dots, in other words, when the pulse eventually fires, as it did on the 14th of January, you can see that pulse eventually fired, you can see what happened to Bitcoin. Bitcoin broke through that support and then dropped significantly lower. In fact, Bitcoin dropped by almost 50%, almost 3,000 points from these levels. So as I explained before in my previous videos, that is why we never fight the momentum of the pulse. So when the momentum, you can see, is negative and its momentum is increasing lower and lower, we never fight this. We don't stand in front of it, because that's like standing in front of a freight train. But notice something that I mentioned in a couple of videos ago has now happened. You can see what happened here. I mentioned very recently that I was expecting the momentum of this pulse signal to eventually come to an end. And you can see that it has now come to an end. You can see the momentum has now dissipated. Notice it's going now the other way, as you can see there. So the momentum behind the pulse signal now has officially dissipated. It's now faded. So this pulse signal has now ended. When the momentum on a pulse signal on this time frame comes to an end, what you usually see is either some sideways action or a counter trend move. And that's what's been happening here so far. You're seeing a sort of a counter trend, small counter trend move, or a little bit of a sideways action here on Bitcoin at present. Now, of course, the big question you're probably wondering is, and the big question many folks out there are asking is this bounce potentially a wave 4? Okay, so if this is wave 3, is this our wave 4? Well, let me just back up a little bit and let me just give you some context. Firstly, what we're talking about, for those of you not familiar, is Elliott wave theory. And this is something I talked about recently. And according to Elliott wave theory, markets tend to trend in 5 waves. And I said some time ago that we're very likely in the second half of this wave 3. And in fact, as you can see here on my charts, this is the chart that shows our LT Elliott waves indicator that I talked to you about in a recent webinar. And our own LT Elliott waves indicator is indicating we're in a very likely wave 3 situation here. And here's something we know about wave 3s, which is that wave 3s usually have very shallow pullbacks. In fact, one of the characteristics of a wave 3 is that they have very shallow, very small pullbacks, like you see over here, okay? See these pullbacks over here? Very shallow bounces, very small pullbacks. And to me, this pullback here on Bitcoin actually is rather mediocre. It's not really significant the way I see it. For example, take a look at this chart of oil. Let me show you this chart of oil. Now, as you probably know, oil prices have been dropping quite significantly. And as you see here on our chart, again, showing our LT Elliott waves indicator, you can see that we're in a very likely wave 3 situation here. We've been in a wave 3 now for some time. And again, notice, when you're in a wave 3, very shallow pullbacks. Notice very mediocre pullbacks. Look at these bounces. These bounces are very shallow, very small, as you can see here. Look at this over here. Very shallow, very small bounces. And again, also in a wave 3, you tend to see the price ignore oversold conditions. So that is why Elliott wave theory can be very useful. It gives you an expectation of how you're dealing with the price and indeed the patterns on the charts. So we just go back to this chart of Bitcoin. First of all, are we in a likely wave 3 here? Is this a wave 3? I believe so, yes. As I just explained a few moments ago, I believe this is a wave 3 situation. But is this bounce here? Does this bounce count as a wave 4? I think it's too early to call that. So at present, I'm going to remain neutral on that. I don't think there's any indication at present that this is a wave 4. It is too early to call. All right, it's too early to say this is a wave 4. We'll have to wait and see how this market plays out in the next few days as we go through the rest of the week. It is possible that Bitcoin might see further follow through higher, perhaps towards some resistance levels. But at present, it's still not very clear. All right, bottom line is this though. Here's the bottom line. I'm still expecting Bitcoin to take out these previous lows that were formed here. I'm still looking for Bitcoin eventually to head lower, head south, and take out these previous lows that were formed just near 3,500. Now, when is that likely to happen? Nobody knows. It could take until the end of December, potentially start of January, or it might actually happen much sooner than that. But the likely scenario is that eventually we're going to take out these previous lows near 3,500. And when we do, the next likely downside targets below 3,500